This section heading is called CLI Basics. So your Cisco devices contain image files, and those image files contain commands that you can use to enable features on your Cisco devices. What we're going to do in this section is we're going to review some key options that we can use when managing these commands through a command line. Now there's many more options that are available. However, the ones that we have listed here in front of us are the most common ones that you would see being used not only on your Cisco equipment but also on a lot of other networking equipment as well. Now, out of all of these key options that are listed over here to the left, the one that should be the most important to you is your question mark. So your question mark is your context sensitive help, and based on the context of how you use it is going to determine what you get back from the system. Now, because it's the most important option, we're first going to take a low-level look at our Cisco IOS in order to understand how to use it better. So now the way that we're going to do this is we're going to start looking at our iOS in terms of code, and we're going to start looking at our modes in terms of the interpreter that they actually use. Notice that we now have a more simplified mode hierarchy where we have essentially two main modes, exec mode and configuration mode. And then from these two modes we have many sub-modes that we can access from them. At each of these modes, you're going to access a different command interpreter, which means we're using a different command list. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what happened to user exec mode and privilege exec mode? Both of those modes are actually using the same command interpreter. The reason that you have more commands in privilege mode as opposed to user mode is because you have more privileges. So in the Cisco world, your privileges are going to restrict or grant what you can actually see on the system. So now when you think of a command interpreter, just think of it as a way as a user to submit a command against a particular command list. Now each of these lists that are used by the interpreters is accessible through the command line. And we can actually use one command to display all of the lists that all the interpreters would actually use. However, what we can do instead is at the top of each of these lists there exists a name that references which interpreter the list belongs to, and we're identifying this by a mode name. Now what we're going to do is we're actually just going to execute this command to pull out each and every one of those names on top of those lists, just so that we can understand that each list belongs to a particular command interpreter. So now here we can actually see all of those names, and once again each of these names pertains to a particular command interpreter. So now this is a representation of what we learned so far, and the next thing that we're going to introduce is a term that's called command parser. So your command interpreters enable a user to submit a command against a particular command list. Your command parser is going to be kind of like in between that whole picture. So it's going to take the command that's submitted by the user, and then it's going to analyze and validate that command against the command list. So now we're getting to the meat of how we're actually going to understand how to use our question mark better. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to dump the command list that belongs to the exec mode interpreter. So I'm going to press Q here to return to a prompt, and then I'm going to scroll through command history to retrieve the following command, and then I'm going to back this off by issuing a Control W multiple times. So this command is going to dump the command list that pertains to that mode, and then what I want you to do now is I want you to envision that each of these commands is now a part of an array. So now when you think of an array, just envision that we have some curly brace at the beginning, one at the end, and now that each of these commands is now strings within it. So in the programming language world, we use arrays so that we can actually pass multiple strings against some code. And that's kind of how we're going to use it in this instance right here as well. So now let's come full circle, and let's see how this understanding of our interpreter and command parser is going to help us to understand how to use the question mark better. So when we execute commands inside of the command line, we're doing so from a particular command interpreter, which means that we're referencing a particular command list, and that our command parser is then going to take the command that we submit and validate and analyze it against that list. Now, when you think of your command parser, I just want you to think of it as kind of like a means of getting information from the command list. Your command parser is actually more than that though. It's going to be kind of like a means of communication between you and the system regarding the list. So for example, When we tried to execute the enable command by simply executing E, our command parser took that command and tried to match it to all the strings in the array, and because it matched more than one string, it actually responded to us with the following message. Now, based on the message that we get, we're supposed to know how to use the question mark. So there's basically two ways. We can either use it right up against the command, or we can use white space between it and the command as seen over here. So now, by understanding the command parser and understanding that our commands are a part of an array, it helps us to understand when we use the question mark that we're returned commands basically like strings in an array, right? So over here, when we put the question mark right up against the command, it's basically in response to the command parser's message that says ambiguous command. Understanding this, that it means that it matched more than one string in an array, we basically say to the command parser, okay, well, what did you find? Right? And then your command parser actually returns to us all the strings in the array that it matched. Okay, so now let's take this a step further. So now something else that we need to understand here is that when we use our question mark, the results that we get back from it is going to be dependent upon where we're using it within the command structure. So your commands may or may not have many arguments that pertain to them. And when we use it in reference to a particular argument, then we're going to envision that our array gets basically shortened to those arguments. So now down here as an example, I did not complete the command syntax for the clock command, and then we will return the following system message over here. Now when we use our question mark in response to that message, we can just envision that all of the level 1 arguments to the command are now in the array, and then when we use the question mark, we're returned all of those arguments inside the command line. Now as another example over here, we can see that we made a syntax error on the level 1 argument, and we can see that our command parser then gave us the following message, right? So now when you're trying to understand what this message means, again, just think of it as all of the arguments as a part of strings in an array, and that your command parser then tried to analyze the strings within there, and it says, you know what, I understand the string up to here, but I have no idea what the heck this character is. Now, one possible thing that you could do in order to understand why it doesn't understand what that character is you could just submit a question mark up against that command, and then you would actually see that your command parser would say, you know what, it's unrecognized, I have no idea what that character is, nothing in my array actually matches that right there. Basically it matches up to the A, and then over here I have no idea. So what you can then do is you can actually replace that character with the question mark to see the only string that it actually matches in the array. So now that we have a better understanding of how to use our question mark, we're going to illustrate how to use some of these other shortcut keys that are listed underneath. So we've already illustrated tab completion as well as a Control Z in other videos, and we're just going to illustrate these ones that are shown down here. Now when I typically discuss these ones, I relate them to the shortcut keys that are common amongst a lot of your applications, kind of like your Control A to select all, your Control C to copy, and your Control X to cut. So now these ones down here are actually common amongst a lot of your command lines and terminals, and these are the more commonly used ones, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, and that's why we're going to illustrate each of these shown right here. So now what I've gone and done is I've added a command onto our command line, and the first one that I'm going to illustrate here is a Control A. So now when you want to memorize that a Control A brings you to the front of the command, just remember that an A is the beginning of your alphabet. Now we can also issue a Control E to go to the end of the command, and E being end. We can also issue a Control W to remove the word, which is to the left of the cursor. So now what's not a part of your word are your kind of like your dots, your dashes, and things like that. Now I actually consider this to be a cut because that gets buffered. So we can actually issue a Control Y here multiple times to paste it back. Now when you kind of think of a Control Y, just think of it as meaning like Y, I have no idea why. A Y would be for a paste, but in any event I couldn't think of any word to kind of make sense of that. So now what we can do here is we can go to the front of the argument over here and we can issue a Control K. So a Control K is going to kill everything from the cursor to the right of the cursor, and we can see that it did just that. Now this is also considered like a cut because we can paste it back. Now, something else that we can do here that I find to be very useful is we can use a Control U. So your Control U will undo everything that we put onto the prompt, right? And again, this is considered a cut because we can actually paste it back.